My husband is resentful of me because I invited his best friend on the day of delivery instead of him, and I want to name our son after him. Instead of being happy because his best friend is attentive to me. Everything was supposed to be about my comfort and the sacred energy of bringing a new life into this world, which is something Robert never seemed to grasp. We had been together for 3 years, and while he's a decent provider, he has this exhausting tendency to vibrate with anxiety whenever things get even slightly intense. Throughout my pregnancy, I found myself constantly having to manage his emotions instead of focusing on my own, which is frankly a full-time job in itself. He would fret over the nursery colors or panic if I had a minor craving at midnight, making the whole experience feel like a burden I was carrying for both of us. It became clear very early on that Robert lacked the emotional fortitude to be a grounding presence when the real work began. I deserved a peaceful environment, and I shouldn't be punished for seeking out the one person who actually knew how to provide it without making a scene. Lewis, Robert's best friend since college, has always been the antidote to Robert's frantic nature. While Robert is all scattered thoughts and sweaty palms, Lewis is calm, observant, and possesses a refined sense of what a woman in my position actually needs. He was the one who would bring over the specific artisanal crackers I liked when Robert was busy Googling how to breathe during contractions for the 10th time. There's a certain synergy between Lewis and me that Robert just couldn't replicate, a silent understanding that my needs are the ultimate priority. I didn't see it as a betrayal to rely on Lewis. I saw it as a logistical necessity for my own mental health. If Robert wanted to be that person, he should have worked on his character flaws years ago instead of expecting me to endure his instability during my most vulnerable moment. When the first real contraction hit at 3 a.m., the house immediately transformed into a theater of the absurd, thanks entirely to Robert's performance. He started pacing the bedroom floor so loudly I thought the floorboards might give way, all while breathing like he was the one in labor. It was incredibly distracting and honestly, quite selfish of him to pollute the air with such heavy, negative energy when I was trying to find my center. I sat there on the edge of the bed, watching him stumble over his own feet while trying to pack a hospital bag we had already finished weeks ago. Every time he looked at me, his eyes were wide with a sort of frantic pity that made me feel more like a medical emergency than a goddess in transition. It was at that exact moment I realized I couldn't do this with him hovering over me like a dark, jittery cloud. Without telling Robert, I picked up my phone and sent a quick text to Lewis, knowing he would be awake and ready to assist. Within 20 minutes, Lewis was at the door, smelling of expensive sandalwood and looking completely composed, which was a breath of fresh air compared to Robert's disheveled mess. Robert looked confused when Lewis walked in, but I didn't have the energy to explain the obvious benefit of having a stable adult in the room. We made our way to the car, and even the drive was a nightmare because Robert kept hitting every pothole while apologizing profusely. Lewis just sat in the back, leaning forward to whisper encouraging things about how strong I was, effectively drowning out Robert's nervous chatter. By the time we reached the hospital, my decision was fully formed and absolutely justified. The hospital staff was professional, but they could clearly see the disparity between the two men trailing behind my wheelchair. Robert was trying to talk to the nurses about our birth plan, but he was stuttering so much they had to ask him to repeat himself 3 times. It was embarrassing to be associated with that level of incompetence, especially when Lewis was standing right there, holding my water bottle and nodding at the staff with perfect poise. I could feel the heavy energy Robert was emitting, a mix of desperation and misplaced authority that was making my blood pressure spike. I needed a partner in that delivery room, not a project, and it was my right to choose who would witness this miracle. When the nurse finally asked who would be staying with me for the active labor, I didn't hesitate for a single second. I looked Robert directly in the eye and told the nurse that I only wanted Lewis in the delivery room with me. The look on Robert's face was one of those over-the-top, dramatic expressions he does when he feels slighted, as if my labor was a spectator sport he had a front-row ticket to. He started stammering about our moment and being there for his son, but I simply didn't have the patience for his ego. I told him quite clearly that his energy was detrimental to the process and that I needed someone who could actually stay focused on me. Lewis looked a bit surprised, but being the gentleman he is, he stepped forward to take my hand while Robert was left standing in the hallway. It wasn't about hurting Robert, it was about protecting the sanctity of the birth from his inevitable meltdown. Inside the delivery room, the atmosphere shifted instantly into one of pure, focused support, exactly as I had envisioned. Lewis was a literal saint, never leaving my side and holding my hand with a firm, steady grip that told me he wasn't going to fold under pressure. He didn't ask stupid questions or try to coach my breathing with a voice that cracked, he just existed in the space as a pillar of strength. Every time a wave of pain hit, I looked at Lewis and saw a man who was fully present, unlike Robert, who would have probably been fainting or crying in the corner. We shared a connection in those hours that was far deeper than anything I had experienced with my husband lately. It felt right, it felt logical, and it felt like I was finally being treated with the reverence I deserved. When our son finally arrived, the joy in the room was palpable, and I felt a sense of triumph that I had managed the environment so perfectly. The nurses were so impressed with Louis's calm demeanor that they naturally gravitated toward him when it was time to hand over the baby. I watched with a smile as Louis became the first person to hold my son, his face lit up with a genuine, peaceful awe that was beautiful to witness. He looked so natural with the baby in his arms, a stark contrast to the image of Robert pacing like a caged animal in the sterile hallway outside. It was a perfect, curated moment of harmony that validated every choice I had made since 3 a.m. I felt empowered, knowing I had prioritized my well-being and the baby's entry into the world over Robert's fragile feelings. Eventually, the nurses let Robert back in, and the shift in the room's energy was immediate and unpleasant. He walked in looking like he had been through a war, his eyes red and his shoulders slumped, completely failing to match the joy of the occasion. Instead of being grateful that his son was healthy and that I was safe, he immediately started acting like I had committed some heinous crime. He wouldn't even look at Louis, who was still being incredibly helpful by adjusting my pillows and making sure I was hydrated. Robert just stood by the bed, radiating this toxic resentment that threatened to ruin my first hour of motherhood. It was so ungrateful of him to bring that bitterness into the room after I had done all the hard work. Now, Robert is being completely impossible, acting as if my choice was an act of malice rather than a calculated decision for a better birth experience. He keeps bringing up how he felt erased and excluded, which is just a fancy way of saying he's throwing a tantrum because he wasn't the center of attention. I've tried to explain to him that Louis was simply the more functional choice, but he refuses to see reason, preferring to wallow in his own perceived victimhood. It's truly exhausting to deal with a man who can't appreciate the fact that his best friend stepped up when he couldn't. I just chose the person who was actually helpful, and if Robert can't handle that reality, it really says more about his insecurities than my actions. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says you literally replaced the father during the most important moment of his life just because he was nervous. That's not being a chaos provocateur, that's being a heartless partner. Poor Robert was outside while his best friend took his place. OP's reply: I didn't replace anyone, I upgraded the support system for the safety of the baby. If Robert wanted the spot, he should have invested in some basic emotional regulation instead of being a human panic attack. Priorities, honey. Anonymous user 2 says what kind of a best friend agrees to stay in the delivery room while the father is barred from entry? Louis is just as bad as you are for enabling this level of disrespect toward Robert. This whole dynamic is incredibly shady. OP's reply: Louis agreed because he actually cares about my comfort, unlike people who think a woman's labor is just a backdrop for their own daddy fantasies. We have a mature connection that Robert is clearly too small-minded to understand. Update 1. It's been 2 days since my last update, and we have finally returned home, though the atmosphere in the house is colder than the hospital's industrial freezer. Robert is still clinging to his resentment like a security blanket, barely speaking to me and moving through the rooms like a ghost who's forgotten how to haunt. It's incredibly draining to be around someone who is so determined to be miserable, especially when I should be resting and enjoying these first moments with the baby. I decided that since I did all the heavy lifting and made the smart executive decisions during labor, I deserved to have the final say on the baby's identity. To show Louis how much I truly appreciated him stepping up while Robert was busy having a breakdown, I decided to name the baby after him. The opportunity presented itself perfectly when the hospital administrator brought in the final paperwork while Robert was out on one of his frequent, I need air coffee runs. I didn't see the point in waiting for another circular argument about traditional family names or Robert's late grandfather. I picked up the pen and clearly wrote Louis on the form, feeling a rush of satisfaction that my son would carry the name of a man who actually knows how to be present. When the nurse came back later with the little hospital bracelet that had the name printed on it, I felt a sense of rightness in the world. I tucked it under the baby's blanket, waiting for the right moment to let the reality of the situation sink in for Robert. The moment happened about an hour after we got through the front door of our house, and Robert's reaction was predictably over the top. He was changing a diaper poorly, I might add, when he caught a glimpse of the name on the ID band I had left on the changing table. He froze, his face turning a strange shade of gray, before he asked me in this trembling voice why our son had his best friend's name instead of the one we had discussed. I didn't see the need to lie. I told him quite calmly that names are earned through actions, not just biological technicalities. Louis earned that honor by being the one who didn't faint or pace like a lunatic while I was in active labor. Robert actually had the nerve to raise his voice, claiming that I was stealing his right to name his own child and that this was a direct slap in the face. I just sat there on the sofa, nursing the baby, and told him that his shouting was exactly why I chose Louis for the delivery room. His inability to handle a simple naming choice without a theatrical display of emotion just proved my point further. I reminded him that I was the one who went through hours of physical agony, so my vote naturally carries more weight than his. If he wanted to be the namesake of his son, he should have shown a shred of the competence Louis displayed during the birth. Since that conversation, Robert has effectively moved into the guest room, or the couch, depending on how dramatic he's feeling at any given hour. I haven't tried to stop him because, frankly, the extra space in the bed is much more comfortable for me and the baby. It's actually quite peaceful not having his wrong energy hovering over me while I'm trying to bond with little Louis. He acts like I've exiled him, but he's the one choosing to sit in the dark and brood like a teenager. I'm just moving forward with my life and making sure the baby is surrounded by people who are actually capable of providing support. Speaking of actual support, Louis came over today with a beautiful 3-course dinner from that Italian place I love, because he actually remembers my preferences. He didn't even mention the name on the birth certificate at first, he just walked in, saw the baby, and started helping out immediately. While Robert was hiding in the other room pretending to be busy with work, Louis was right there with me, helping with the diapers and making sure I was eating. It was such a contrast to see a man who just does what needs to be done without demanding a gold medal for it. Louis noticed the name on the nursery door, a little wooden sign I'd put up, and he gave me the most modest, humble smile I've ever seen. I could tell Louis was touched by the gesture, even if he was too polite to make a big deal out of it in front of a brooding Robert. We spent the afternoon talking about the baby's future and how Louis is going to be such a positive influence in his life. It felt like a real family unit for a few hours, a glimpses of what life could be like if people just dropped their egos and focused on what works. Every time Robert walked through the kitchen to get water, he would glare at us, but I just ignored him and kept laughing at Louis's jokes. It's not my fault that Robert chooses to be an outsider in his own home while Louis is naturally integrating into our new routine. Robert eventually tried to corner me in the kitchen after Louis left, asking if I realized how insane this all looked to the outside world. I told him that I don't live my life for the outside world, I live it for the efficiency and peace of my household. He kept harping on the fact that Louis is his best friend, and that I'm using him to hurt Robert. It's so typical of Robert to make everything about his own pain, as if I have nothing better to do than plot against him. I told him that if he's hurt, it's because he's comparing himself to a better man and finding himself lacking. I've decided that if Robert wants to be part of this family, he needs to earn his way back in by matching the standard Louis has set. Until then, he can keep sleeping on the couch and complaining to whoever will listen about how unfair life is. I have a baby to raise, and I'm going to make sure that baby knows exactly who was there for us when it counted. Names have power, and naming my son Louis is a constant reminder of the excellence I expect in this house. If Robert finds that threatening, then perhaps he should take some notes on how to be an attentive partner. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says naming the baby after the best friend while the husband is out getting coffee is a direct slap to Robert's face. You didn't do it because Louis earned it, you did it to humiliate the man you're supposed to love. This is pure malice. OP's reply: it's a tribute to excellence, not a slap. If Robert feels humiliated, it's because he knows he didn't show up when it mattered. He should take notes instead of whining about a birth certificate. Anonymous user 2 says, is this baby even Robert's? The way you're obsessing over Louis and literally replacing Robert's name and role makes me think there's a lot more going on here. Robert needs a DNA test yesterday. OP's reply: that is a very toxic and typical thing for an internet stranger to say. We are just a very close trio with a deep bond. Just because you can't imagine a platonic friendship providing more support than a husband doesn't make it a conspiracy. Update 2. It's been 1 week since my last update, and the silence from Robert has become a permanent fixture in the house, which honestly makes it much easier to hear the baby's soft breathing. He's stopped talking to Louis entirely, which is so incredibly immature considering Louis has done nothing but be a supportive friend to both of us. Robert told me during a brief, heated exchange that he feels erased from his own family, which is such a manipulative way to frame the situation. I find it absolutely exhausting that he's trying to make my postpartum period a time when I should be pampered and shielded from stress all about his bruised ego. He acts like I've physically removed him from the house, when in reality, he's the one retreating into his own shell of self-pity. To fix the vibe of the house and show Robert that I'm a bigger person, I decided to invite Louis over for a weekend stay to help us bond as a group. I figured that if Robert spent more time seeing how Louis and I interact, he might finally learn how to be a useful presence instead of a nervous wreck. Louis, being the selfless person he is, agreed immediately, even though he knew Robert was being difficult. When Louis arrived with his weekend bag, Robert didn't even come out of the bedroom to greet him, he just stayed in there with the door shut like a brooding teenager. It was so embarrassing to have to apologize to Louis for my husband's lack of basic manners and hospitality. I spent the majority of the weekend in the living room with Louis, and it was the most relaxed I've felt since the baby was born. We spent hours laughing and talking about everything under the sun while the baby napped in his bassinet between us. At one point, I held the baby up and pointed out to Louis how he seems to have a similar nose shape to his. It's just a cute little observation, but Louis really appreciated it. We were bonding over the growth of this new life, creating a beautiful, harmonious environment that Robert chose to exclude himself from. Every time I heard Robert shuffle around in the bedroom, I just felt a wave of pity for his inability to join in the joy we were creating. The highlight of the weekend for me was taking a beautiful photo of Louis holding the baby by the window, with the sunlight hitting them just right. Louis looked so natural, so protective, and so utterly right in that role of a support system. I decided to post it on my social media with the caption, "The two men who actually show up," because I believe in honesty and giving credit where it's due. I knew Robert would see it. He spends enough time scrolling on his phone in that dark bedroom, and I hoped it would be the wake-up call he needed. It wasn't meant to be a jab, it was a factual statement about who was currently participating in our lives. Robert did eventually come out of the room later that evening, but he didn't yell or throw the tantrum I was half expecting. He just walked into the kitchen, looked at me and Louis sitting on the sofa together, and he looked empty. His eyes were completely vacant, like the lights were on but nobody was home, which was even more annoying than his usual anxiety. He didn't even mention the post or the fact that Louis had been sleeping in our guest room for 2 days. He just grabbed a glass of water and walked back to the bedroom without saying a single word to either of us. It's so manipulative how he uses silence to try and make me feel guilty for simply enjoying my life. Louis stayed until Sunday evening, and by the time he left, I felt like a whole new woman, recharged and validated in my choices. He promised to come back soon and even offered to take the baby for a few hours so I could get a full night's sleep. That's the kind of proactive care that Robert seems completely incapable of grasping. After Louis drove away, I went into the bedroom to talk to Robert, but he was just staring at the wall, refusing to acknowledge my presence. I told him that his behavior was ruinous to our family dynamic and that he should be thanking Louis for filling the gaps he's left behind. He finally spoke, but it was just more of the same, "I don't recognize my life," and "you're replacing me," nonsense. I told him that no one can replace someone who isn't effectively there in the first place. If he feels like he's being pushed out, it's only because he refuses to step up and occupy the space that a father and husband should. I'm not going to stop living my life or accepting help just because his ego is too fragile to handle a little competition. He needs to realize that the world doesn't stop turning just because he's feeling insecure about his best friend's superior social skills. The rest of the week has been more of the same, with Robert acting like a martyr while I handle everything with Louis's remote guidance. I've started sending Louis daily updates and photos of the baby, and he always responds with the sweetest, most encouraging messages. It's nice to have someone who actually celebrates the small wins instead of focusing on how erased they feel. Robert sees the notifications on my phone, of course, but he's opted for this weird, stoic silence that I find incredibly boring. I'm starting to wonder if he's even trying anymore, or if he's just waiting for me to apologize for being happy. I'm not going to apologize for creating a support system that actually works, even if it doesn't look like the traditional nuclear family Robert has in his head. My priority is little Louis and ensuring he grows up in a house filled with laughter and stability, not nervous pacing and resentment. If that means Louis spends more time here than Robert does, then so be it. Efficiency and emotional health come before outdated social norms every single time. Robert can either get on board with the new program or continue his residency in the guest room. Either way, I'm not changing a thing. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "Robert, leave now. This woman is literally replacing you in real time and documenting it for the world to see. Inviting the friend for a weekend stay while you're miserable is the ultimate level of disrespect. Get out before she completely erases your existence." OP's reply, "He can't leave, he hasn't even mastered the car seat yet and wouldn't know the first thing about a nighttime routine. He needs this structure, even if his ego is currently having a tantrum about it." Anonymous user 2 says, "It's so obvious that you are enjoying the chaos you're causing. Posting that photo with that caption wasn't about honesty, it was about twisting the knife in your husband's back. You're playing a dangerous game with your marriage." OP's reply, "I'm enjoying the peace Louis provides, not chaos." There's a difference between being a provocateur and simply stating the truth about who is actually helping. If the truth hurts Robert, that's a Robert problem. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and Robert has finally reached a level of pettiness that I didn't think he was capable of achieving. Instead of talking to me like an adult, he decided to weaponize our families by calling a meeting with my parents and his parents at our house. I walked into the living room to find all 4 of them sitting there with grim expressions, looking like a tribunal ready to pass judgment. Robert sat in the corner, looking smug in that quiet, wronged way he does, while he passed around a tablet. He showed them everything: the birth photos Louis took, the birth certificate with Louis's name on it, and even my social media posts. The reaction from the parents was predictably narrow-minded and lacked any understanding of the nuance involved in my decisions. My own mother, who is usually on my side, had the audacity to look me in the eye and call me cruel for what I've done. She started crying about how Robert was denied his birthright, and how I was humiliating the family name. It was so disappointing to see her fall for Robert's victim narrative without even considering the stress he put me through during the pregnancy. His parents were even worse, muttering about disrespect and scandal, as if we were living in a Victorian novel instead of the modern world. I tried to explain the logic that Louis was the one who provided the emotional stability I needed, but they just kept shouting over me. They acted like the name on a birth certificate is more important than the actual quality of care the baby receives. Robert just sat there, letting them do his dirty work for him, which is exactly the kind of cowardice that made me turn to Louis in the first place. Now, everyone is officially taking Robert's side, and my phone has been blowing up with concerned messages from relatives I haven't spoken to in years. It's a coordinated campaign of harassment just because I dared to prioritize my own mental health over a man's ego. To make matters worse, Louis is starting to feel uncomfortable with all the family drama, which is exactly what Robert wanted. Louis called me yesterday and said he might need some space because he doesn't want to be the epicenter of a domestic war. I told him straight up not to let Robert's insecurity and our parents' outdated views ruin the beautiful vibe we've created. It's so typical of people to attack something pure and helpful just because it doesn't fit their rigid little boxes of a normalcy. I told Louis that he is the backbone of this new family structure and that he shouldn't let Robert's petty family meeting scare him away. I decided that since Robert wanted to play the family values card, I would give him a real taste of what a lack of value looks like. I cornered him in the kitchen after everyone left and told him that if he doesn't start acting like a Louis, meaning being helpful, calm, and supportive, he shouldn't be surprised by the consequences. I told him quite clearly that if he continues to be a secondary character in his own home, the baby is naturally going to grow up calling Louis Dad. It's not a threat, it's a biological and emotional observation of how children bond with the people who actually show up for them. Robert looked like I had slapped him, which was a bit much considering I was just stating a likely future outcome. He tried to argue that he's the biological father, as if that's some kind of magic shield that excuses his incompetence and resentment. I told him that a dad is a title that is earned through daily consistency, not just a 10-minute contribution 9 months ago. If he wants the title, he needs to beat the competition, but instead, he's just whining to our parents like a little boy. The more he pushes back with this separation and talk, the more he proves that he's not the man I thought he was. Louis still hasn't come over since the family meeting, and the house feels strangely empty without his positive energy. I've been sending him photos of the baby in the little outfits he bought, but his replies have become shorter and more hesitant. I know he's just overwhelmed by the drama Robert manufactured, but it's still frustrating that Robert is winning this round by being a snitch. I'm doing my best to keep the mood up for the baby, but it's hard when your husband is actively trying to dismantle your support system. I spent the afternoon looking at the birth certificate, feeling proud that I at least stood my ground on the name. I've started telling the baby, look, little Louis, we're going to be just fine, even if your father is being a drama queen. I want him to get used to the sound of his name and the idea that his mother is a woman who makes things happen. Robert hears me saying it, and I can see his jaw clench every single time, which gives me a small, satisfying sense of control. If he wants to be the head of the household, he needs to start acting like a head and not a tail that wags every time his parents get upset. I'm staying firm in my position because I know that, eventually, people will see that I was just trying to create a better world for my son. The tension is at an all-time high, but I'm not backing down. If anything, this has made me more determined to prove that my way is the right way. I'm planning on hosting a small sip and see for my friends next week, and Louis is the first person on the guest list. I don't care if Robert likes it or if our parents approve, it's my house and my life. If Robert wants to sit in the guest room and pout while we celebrate my son's life, that's his choice. I'm going to keep showing him what a real man looks like by inviting Lewis back into our space, whether Robert is ready for it or not. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says telling a father to his face that his child will grow up calling another man dad is the ultimate betrayal. You aren't provocative, you are intentionally cruel. Robert needs to take that baby and run as far away from you as possible. OP's reply: it's called a performance review, honey. If he's failing at the job of being a father, he shouldn't be surprised when someone more qualified gets the title. Truth hurts, I guess. Anonymous user 2 says Robert, please get a DNA test immediately. The way she is pushing Lewis onto that child and erasing you is beyond suspicious. This whole situation screams that she wants Lewis to be the father because he actually is. OP's reply: how dare you suggest my son is some kind of a test subject. Your obsession with biological technicalities is just as boring as Robert's ego. We are a modern family, even if you can't wrap your brain around it. Update 4. It's been 1 month since my last update, and my plan to make Robert better through a little healthy competition has completely backfired in the most spectacular and unfair way. I truly thought that by showing him what a real support system looked like, he would eventually snap out of his shell and try to outdo Lewis. Instead of rising to the occasion, Robert decided to go lower than I ever imagined he would. He didn't come to me with an apology or a plan to be more present. He came to me with a folder from a high-end law firm. He actually served me with a formal demand for a DNA test and a separation agreement right in our own living room. I was sitting there holding little Lewis when he handed me the papers, and for a second, I thought it was just more of his dramatic posturing. But the coldness in his eyes was different this time. It wasn't the empty look from before, it was a hard, calculated resolve that felt completely foreign. He didn't even yell, he just told me that he refuses to live in a delusion any longer and that he wants legal clarity on everything. It's so incredibly insulting that after everything I went through to bring this child into the world, he wants to treat my son like a science project. He's making a mockery of our marriage just because he couldn't handle his best friend being more attentive than he was. But the real betrayal, the one that actually stung, came from the person I did all of this for. The second things got too real, and the lawyers got involved, my attentive support system, Lewis, completely panicked and showed his true colors. I tried to call him to tell him about the DNA test and the separation papers, but my calls went straight to voicemail every single time. I sent him a long, heartfelt text explaining that I needed him now more than ever, only to see those dreaded 2 gray checkmarks that never turned blue. It turns out that Lewis, the man I praised for his strength and calm, was just a coward who couldn't handle a bit of real-world friction. I eventually found out through a mutual friend that Lewis hasn't just been ignoring me, he's blocked my number entirely to save his friendship with Robert. He told people that he can't be around this mess, and that he feels used by me to provoke his best friend. Can you believe the audacity of that? After I gave him the honor of being in the delivery room and named my firstborn child after him, he treats me like I'm some kind of radioactive disaster. He was happy to play the role of the perfect man when it was all about artisanal crackers and hospital visits, but as soon as there are consequences, he runs back to Robert like a scared dog. So now, here I am, sitting in a house that feels like a tomb with a baby who bears the name of a man who won't even answer my texts. Robert is still in the house for now, but he won't look at me or speak a single word without his legal representative on speakerphone. He's moved all of his things into the guest room permanently and spends his evenings looking at local apartment listings. Every time I call out the baby's name, Lewis, it just echoes back at me as a reminder of how quickly a perfect people can disappear when things get difficult. I'm surrounded by the wreckage of a life I was just trying to optimize for everyone's benefit. The worst part is that my parents and Robert's parents have formed a united front against me, supporting Robert's legal moves and acting like I'm some kind of villain. They've stopped offering to help with the baby, saying they'll wait for the results before they commit to any more grandparenting duties. It's so cruel to hold a baby's affection hostage over a piece of paper, but that's the kind of people I'm dealing with now. I'm doing everything alone: the nights, the feedings, the diapers, while the 2 men who were supposed to be my pillars are either hiding behind lawyers or blocking my calls. I was just trying to show Robert what a real man looks like, and in the process, I managed to lose both of them. I look at little Lewis and I still see that nose shape we joked about, but now it just makes me feel a bitter, sharp pang of regret that I can't quite suppress. I wanted a life of harmony and superior support, but I ended up with a legal battle and a reputation that's been shredded by people who don't understand my vision. I'm still convinced that my logic was sound, that a woman in labor deserves the best possible environment, but I clearly underestimated how much men value their egos over actual results. I'm stuck with a name that now feels like a brand of betrayal, and a husband who treats me like a stranger he's forced to share a kitchen with. I don't know what the DNA test will show. Well, I know it's Robert's, obviously, but the fact that it's even happening feels like the end of something that can never be repaired. Robert won't care if the test proves he's the father. He's already decided that the emotional infidelity, as his lawyer calls it, is enough to end us. It's so petty to end a marriage over who held a hand during a contraction or what name is on a piece of paper. They say you should never meet your heroes, and I guess the same goes for perfect best friends who act like saints until the bill comes due. I'm just a woman who wanted excellence, and now I'm just a woman with a baby and a very expensive lawyer. I'm going to have to change the baby's name eventually, I suppose, but for now, I'm keeping it just to spite them both. Every time Robert hears me call for Louis, I want him to remember that there was a time when he wasn't enough, and every time Louis hears about it through the grapevine, I want him to feel the weight of his cowardice. I've learned that support is a very fragile thing when it's not backed up by someone who actually has a spine. I was trying to build a masterpiece of a family, but I was working with clay that was far too weak for the structure. Now I'm just waiting for the next legal filing, wondering how a plan for peace turned into such a total, miserable war.